Yeah, I'm actually a Metro Detroit native, so I'm happy to be home today. What I'll do is I'll just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover. I'll talk about the general challenges of stewarding born digital content, which I'm sure you'll be very familiar with. Give a very brief history of select storage media examples that I've frequently encountered in our special collections and through processing our collections. Give you a quick overview of just magnetic media disk geometry, just so there's a little bit of context in understanding legacy media. I'll talk a little bit about our institution, my role within it, and the Born Digital Content Preservation Service, which is primarily focused around reformatting and migrating contents from obsolete media. Then I'll talk about a project I've been working on and a little bit more about our developing digital preservation service, additional services that we have going on. So, as we know, there are certainly some challenges with working with digital content that aren't there when you're working with paper. With paper, you don't necessarily need layers of intermediary technology to interact with it. You can pick it up, and it's immediately, legible. Digital media is not illegible. You have layers of hardware, you have software, you have attendant devices in order to bring this object alive, in order to interact with it. You can think of digital objects as sort of a set of instructions for future interaction, where that interaction is dependent on your software, hardware, whatever, that are all, at each point, they're subject to obsolescence. When we're working with reformatting or with moving and migrating content, there are concerns of maintaining authenticity and provenance. As we all know, digital content is very volatile. It's subject to change, whether we intend it to change or not. So when you're working with content and migrating it to either a new format or a new storage medium, you may unintentionally lose metadata or contextual information that can be important in the future and can affect any sort of authority or reliability of that data. We also have, of course, resource issues. Finding the funds, the staff, equipment, and storage to support these activities can be a challenge. With staff, there are attendant knowledge and skill sets that you need in order to maintain this content, such as understanding historic computing platforms, either hardware, software, that kind of thing. And of course, you need funds in order to have that staff and pay for the staff, and as well as the technology. And increasingly, it's becoming more difficult to find the hardware and software that you may need. For example, I work very frequently with 5¼ floppy disks. Those drives are not being manufactured anymore. It's all older or secondhand or stuff that I can get from eBay that at this point is 20 and 30 years old. So I have basically a stash, my little hoarder area of floppy drives that I keep, and as they fail, hope that I can keep that content moving along so that I can access content that comes through our collection. There are problems of working at scale. You can have large quantities of content. It's very easy to produce it. You can have thousands of files on a very small storage medium. For example, I'll talk about this later. I've got a 4 gigabyte hard drive that I imaged that had well over 16,000 files. So although there are tools that are improving on how, working with this content in an archival sense of doing processing and doing that sort of descriptive work, it's still very difficult when you're working with heterogeneous content and lots of it. And as I touched on earlier, hardware and software are subject to relatively rapid obsolescence. So compared to paper, the technology of paper is pretty stable. You've had some changes in maybe the underlying structure of the paper, but the concept is still there. You don't need the hardware and the software to work with the paper. But if you think about that compared to how technology has changed over the past 20 years, just in storage media alone, you have the progression of floppy disks to optical media to our flash drives, and now the cloud, which looks like invisible storage. There's still physical back end, but it's taking us away from this, storing data on an object and taking us further away from the interaction with that data. So caring for digital content it requires an iterative approach. It's not a once and done sort of concept. So there is the digital curation center model of it's the life cycle of the digital curation life cycle model. So rather than having a linear, thinking of preservation as a linear sort of thing, it's a continual process relying on a lot of transformative technologies where you're moving content from a variety of environments in order to be able to access that computer or that content at a later date. I'll just give you a very brief overview of storage media history. This is primarily based on what I've seen in our collections. And this quote is actually from the Digital Preservation Manual. It's important to understand the history, just one, so that you can identify it if you run across it, and two, to have that context of how technology has progressed and having that understanding. So one of the earliest digital media, storage media, are punch cards, and these have come into play even as early as 1725 on textile looms. They're basic programs written into the punch cards. And within punch cards themselves, there are a variety of formats. They weren't necessarily standardized until about 1928 through IBM. And then you had magnetic tape, which increased data storage capacity greatly compared to just the cards. So if you think of, if you've seen like a movie from the 60s or 70s where they're in a business situation or there's some sort of large computing environment, you might see these large spinning tapes on a machine in the background or something like that. So these magnetic tapes, there's, open reel, densely packed with data. And then you have a variety of floppy disks. Those came into play about 1971 with the 8-inch floppy disk. And then they became gradually smaller but with larger storage capacities and also working more from an industry standpoint into a more home-based or personal computing use. 5¼ inch floppies were around 1978, and then you have 3.5 about the early 80s. Next storage technology is the hard disk drives. These were around in the 1950s in the larger mainframe computers that would take entire rooms. But for microcomputers, they came in around 1980, and that's also a signal towards more personal computing rather than, I guess, more mainframe sort of work. We have optical media that came on around the early 80s. The first CD-ROMs became popular in the marketplace about 1983. DVD, mid-90s. There's other formats that are very proprietary where you have zip drives and jazz drives, which for the time, a jazz drive with 1 gig of storage was amazing. It was, huge as far as how much you could have on it. And now we're working towards flash drives, having these card reader media that you would have either in your phone or your camera. And then, of course, moving into the cloud where that idea of having a physical object is being reduced. So what I found is important through working with magnetic media, particularly floppy disks and disk drives, is having an understanding of the disk geometry itself, just a basic understanding of you have the physical format, but there are ways in which it's structured so that the operating system and file system can properly address where data is or identify where it is. So you have 3 concept pieces within this media of tracks, which are concentric circles that are read by the head as it passes through a read head. Sectors where they are your smallest chunk of data stored on a disk. And then you have clusters, which are groups of sectors on a disk. And as I said, that's been helpful to understand, particularly when I'm working with disk recovery programs and hardware like the CryoFlux, if you've heard of that. I'll talk about that one a little bit as well. So to give you a little bit of context about our university library, even though it's called the university library, it's not just one library. We have a main university library building that houses many departmental libraries. We have a number of campus-wide libraries dispersed throughout campus. These include our special collections, our university library. Some of our special collections units are the Sousa Archives and Center for American Music, and our Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Currently, we are collections-wise, we're the largest public research university in the research library in the U.S. We have about 13 million volumes and about 24 million items and materials in a variety of formats, languages, and subjects. I am actually situated in our preservation unit, and part of what I do is I manage the Born Digital Content Preservation Service, which includes working with the Born Digital Content Reformatting Lab. This is a place where we'll have a variety of computers and drives and software where I can begin to recover content from our collections. The idea here was to have a centralized location since our libraries are so large and we are starting to receive more Born Digital content. It made sense to structure it within the Technical Services Unit, which the Preservation Unit is part of, so that there aren't a number of different activities happening throughout the library. So it's more of a programmatic and coordinated effort. And also avoiding trying to maintain a number of hardware or software in duplicate throughout the library. I've been in the position since October 2011. There was very little sort of coordinated, centralized activity going on in the preservation unit prior to that. Mostly our digital preservation work was coming out of research or just happening, sporadically throughout our library. And prior to that position, I worked as a grad student working on the pilot program to test out, if a migration service or a service like this would be useful to the library. Since I am working centralized, I'm working very closely and collaboratively with different units and different folks within the library. We're working on, the primary activity is reformatting content, doing that transformative sort of work from the obsolete storage media that's at risk to a more managed environment. But I also have been working, we now have a Born Digital Special Collections Working Group where we're developing policies, procedures, and workflow to ensure consistency, to ensure that we can get as much information up front at the time of acquisition or doing pre-acquisition to ensure that we have the best that we can do so that our preservation activities will have a little more success later on. I'm also working on developing technical appraisal reports, so should a donor or someone come forth that has digital or Born Digital content, I would be able to help out the collection manager with identifying what the challenges might be with this content, how much work it might how much work it will be for us to preserve this, so that they can make appraisal decisions in that way. So far this year, since July, I've reformatted about 1,000 discrete items, and they've been primarily 5 1/4-inch floppy disks. We've received a couple of fairly large collections, one of which was from a professor in the electrical and computer engineering department that contained a lot of his research data that was produced in the late 80s, early 90s. So the untitled hidden track. I'm using digital forensics tools and techniques to help me ensure that I am making a complete preservation copy of whatever storage medium I have. If you have something like you have a Mac drive and you try to plug it into, a Windows computer, that Windows machine might not understand how that disk is formatted. It might not completely show all of the information that is on that disk. So digital forensics techniques and tools, the software is primarily designed to be operating system agnostic. So one of the techniques I use is disk imaging, where I'm making a one-to-one copy of all of the bits on the disk. And this can be content that has been deleted. There might be other hidden content, something that's been squirreled away within the file system that a native file system might not quite understand. So in order to do this, I need a way to interface the drive with a modern computing environment. So I have a variety of adapters, bridges, interfaces, and write blockers. And what write blockers do is they prevent signals from being kicked back to that source media and making it avoids making any sort of changes. One of my primary tools that I use is the FRED, which is the Forensics Recovery of Evidence device. It has an internal write blocking unit and has a number of interfaces actually on the front of the unit so that I don't have to pull the machine apart. I can actually just plug that into the front of the machine. Although the FRED was a significant investment on our part, but I kind of feel like if one is getting into digital preservation or digital forensics work, you don't necessarily need the FRED, but I would highly suggest a newer computing platform just so when you're working with drives that are 20 and 30 years old, you don't have to go through the troubleshooting process of trying to identify, is it the machine that I'm working on? Is it the drive I'm working on? It saves you a little bit of heartache, which I found out the hard way. So the FRED does provide a very solid working platform, but I do, even though I'm trying to avoid, by and large, the sort of computer museum approach, there are still some older machines that I need, the so-called Rosetta computers, that you can use to bridge from, say, a very old technology to something intermediate and moving it forward to something contemporary. One of the projects that I'm currently working on that I received from our Sousa archives, this was a laptop recovered from Michael Mannion, who was a percussionist and American composer of electrical acoustic music. He completed his master's at the University of Illinois in 1983. This machine is a Mac PowerBook 3400C that's circa about 1997. For its time, it was a very powerful machine. It was meant to be a desktop replacement. And this composer was he was actually working on this machine when he had a stroke that was ultimately fatal, which is unfortunate. But it contains the last works that he was working on, his last compositions, manuscripts, all that source material. That was very important to retain and not modify. So when I received the machine, it was having some power issues. It was intermediately power on. I did a little bit of work on it. Wasn't able to successfully keep it going in a way that I felt, absolutely certain that I could get a good disk image off of it. So I ended up sending this machine to a digital forensics vendor for recovery. They created a forensics image for me. That way I was able to, get that data off of the machine successfully in a first pass and not making any sort of modifications to it. This machine actually had a Mac OS 8.6, which is the file system was HFS+, which I've also found out a lot of the forensics tools such as Bit Curator and other tools that are available. Forensics tools aren't necessarily, since they're coming out of the law enforcement world, they're not necessarily interested in legacy formats or making tools for older formats. So something that came out of the 90s that, before digital forensics was really sort of solidified, there's not a lot of tools to work with this. So I found that some of the challenges that I've had are just extracting content or having some of the tools understand what that file system is, extracting content from the drive itself. I've had issues with compatibility of file names. So a Mac file might have illegal characters or characters that are illegal in Windows. They're fine in Mac, but just doesn't make that crossover. So I've had to do a lot of manual work with trying to recover that. 2 minutes. Okay. So yeah, there was lots of content, lots of challenges. That's something that I'm working on and keeping my brain busy with right now. And part of our activities, some of our final, what I'll talk about finally, we do have a digital preservation service that we're working on, which is both a collection registry, our inventory for content, and our repository. So as I'm migrating stuff off of obsolete media, I'm trying to put it somewhere so it's more managed, and so that we at least have a copy. We have a bit level sort of preservation work happening, so that in the future, once there are better tools or we have better technologies, we actually have the content to work with. We have something that's solid to work from. So yeah, my next steps are working on migration plans and emulations. So I'm working on case studies for that. Great. Well, thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Do we have questions?
I do. How did you find both the forensics tools? Was that something that you learned about in graduate school? Or did you do a little more forensic work and find them on your own?
Well, some of it was through my graduate work. I had a graduate assistantship where I was beginning to work on this content. And the supervisor I was working with, she didn't have a familiarity with the tools. So it was fortuitous. Around that time, a paper came out by Michael Kirschenbaum called Digital Forensics in Libraries and Archives. So that was a really great sort of key step in understanding, okay, here's some tools available. But I also had to do a lot of legwork. And I found that the gaming community actually is really great about, developing tools for reformatting and pulling legacy content off.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Tom?
Well, there's a question online.
Okay.
When you're reformatting, how often do you experience content or data loss? And then what are your metrics for determining a successful migration?
There are some, generally with the tools I'm using, there are some sort of error mechanisms in logging that will let me know if there's been a bad sector or if it hasn't been able to recover content. So generally I'm working with the log files and seeing what kind of reporting tools I'm getting, or reports I'm getting back from the tools to determine if there's data loss. With the CryoFlux, that's an adapter that actually works at the bit level. It just kind of, I think it works at the magnetic flux level is what they call it. But you're actually just pulling off any direct images from that disk. So I'm relying on the reporting that I'm getting from there, and a lot of the tools are very extensive on if there's a failure or if a sector is bad or if I haven't recovered disks or recovered content. That's usually what I'm relying on.
I think you mentioned that you were in the technical services unit. At least in my mind, that it's like kind of cataloging and that sort of thing too. Is that correct? And if so, do you find that's a good fit for your position?
Well, within our library, our technical services, we have preservation, conservation, some of our processing, and some of our cataloging. So although we're kind of administratively under that umbrella, we're not necessarily it's just more of an administrative function. But in terms of how I work with other units, I do think that having it within the preservation unit is helpful in that I'm in a centralized unit. I'm not necessarily working out of just our archives or something like that. So it does allow me to work a little more broadly and be more of a service to the collections. So what I've seen so far, I felt like it's been a good fit. And actually, with you mentioning cataloging, we may be working more closely with our metadata librarians, which will, since with the type of content I'm working with and trying to structure useful representation information and metadata, it is actually pretty helpful to have that kind of close contact.
We have Bit Curator here.
Okay.
And the students wanted to work on a digital forensics project this summer, so I'm lining that up right now. But I've tested some of the other tools, and in an ideal world, what else would you like to have as far as tools for what you do? Or what don't they do yet?
Well, I'm finding that there is a need for stronger content identification tools. So in the case of where I'm imaging entire hard drives, I'm pulling everything off of there, like system files, application information. And in some cases there is, you can understand like a clear how the file system organizes some of this information, but I think having like a better mapping of understanding what are system files, what might be useful as technical metadata versus, this is the content that the creator has created, and we might want this, this is described in a different way. Having tools that can help differentiate that rather than working on a file-by-file level, which is just not sustainable.
Right. Okay.
I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Which other tools were you looking at when you made the decision about acquiring FED, and what made you choose that one, comparing it to other ones if you did that, and if you have been using another ones, it would be great if you mentioned them.
Well, when I made the decision to get the FRED, it was primarily for the technical service or the technical support they provided, warranty information, having that integrated environment where it had the right blocker, and just being a tool that's designed for disk imaging and pulling content off, as well as being a very large machine that I can add more storage and work with very quickly and easily to pull in new hard drives. I really liked it for that. I had considered just having a newer server, and I had even built a couple machines in the intermediary, and I just found that when I was doing troubleshooting and finding issues with my computing platform, it made more sense to have something that was stable, that I didn't necessarily have to do a lot of legwork, or if something did go wrong, we had a warranty, I could have that repaired. So that's the decision why. That's why I went with that. And as I said, one can use, a higher-end server. It doesn't have some of the functionality that the FRED does. You would just have to add on more adapters. It doesn't have that sort of built-in piece to it, but I've been pretty happy, satisfied with it so far. So
That's a big thing, just to be able to say that's great, especially since we're still in its infancy.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you so much.